Welcome back. Today I want to talk about the all-important engine behind the bullet, and that's the powders that you use in your cartridge case. Powders, I think, are probably one of the least understood components of the rifle and pistol, or shotgun for that matter. There is not much education associated with regard to powders, unless you do some investigation on your own and bone up on exactly what they are and what they do. Otherwise, you just simply open up a loading book, and this is perfectly all right. You can open up a loading book and look down the page for 308 cartridges for, say, a 150 grain bullet, and you can pick out a load, and one is as good as another. But if you understand what it is that each of these powders do, you have a little bit better understanding about what's more efficient and what's less efficient in a given cartridge. We are very fortunate these days to have a huge number of powders to pick from. I would say that we have easily 4 times more powders to pick from today than we had 30 years ago, easily. We have powders that will fill every possible need, from the smallest 25 ACP pistol cartridge all the way up to the 50 BMG, and everything in between, at all different bullet weights, no matter what the bore size, no matter what the cartridge case capacity, there's a powder to fill the need. And in fact, there's not a powder to fill the need. In most cartridge cases, there are perhaps over 24 that would fill the need very handily in any given bullet weight. This was not necessarily true 35 years ago. The big reason for that is that it has been in those last 35 years or so that hand loading has become gradually, increasingly more popular, and very much more popular in just the last 8 or 10 years. It's that over-the-counter popularity that the individual consumer brings to the game that has increased competitiveness and has brought a lot more powders on the scene and put more selection on the shelves. The history of powders, basically back before I would say the 60s, was primarily a manufacturer's market. The manufacturers made powders for their own particular uses, and that's what they loaded into commercial cartridges. They used powders which had average burning rates that they could use, one bulk powder that would cover a very broad range of bullet weights and cartridge calibers. And, there's very good economic reasons for that, because obviously it cuts down on setup time, storage of components, and all those things. So there were certain powders which they stuck to for pretty much most of their cartridges. As burning rates became more, I would say, far more specific, the hand loader has now been able to pick particular burning rates for particular bullets, particular bore diameters, and particular cartridge case capacities that the manufacturers had no particular interest in when they were doing it for just the commercial loading. Primarily the hand loader has desired to have faster velocities, more efficient cartridges that correspond with true velocities on a chronograph that people can now purchase. In 1975, you needed to have a huge amount of money to go out and buy an Ola chronograph. If you wanted to buy a chronograph, you had to lay out hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and it was a big deal to set it up. It was very complicated. The earliest chronographs back in the 50s and 60s involved shooting through actual physical screens. You had to replace the screens for every single shot, if you can imagine that. Because the consumer has become more educated about what his actual velocities are, the manufacturers have corresponded by providing far more variety and a lot more competition in that industry. There are right now, at last count, probably about 160, close to 160 different powders that are available. that fill every different range. And there are they have burning rates which are measured in a numerical order from 1 to about 67 for the BMG. Now, if you do your own math, there's over 2.5 or 3 different powders in each particular burning rate. 160 different powders, but there's only about 65, excluding the BMG, there's really only about 55 different burning rates that are usable for most cartridges. So you have 3 or 4 different burning rates that do virtually the same thing. When you open up a loading manual, and you have to have a loading manual, I'm telling you right now, if you don't have a loading manual, get at least one. Make sure you have that on your loading bench. Nobody should be loading anything without a loading manual. You can get a very simple, free loading manual from any one of the powder manufacturers. The stores have to carry those in stock. And nowadays with the internet, you can download one off a PDF file. There's no reason, if you're watching this on a computer, there's no reason that you don't have access to loading data directly from the powder manufacturers or even the bullet manufacturers. But you should always have a loading book on the bench so that you can refer to it and keep the page open to what you're loading. If you don't know what I'm talking about, this is a loading manual right here. This is a nozzler. You can get, I highly recommend this one here. Has particular usefulness because Richard Lee has placed all the different powders in order of velocity, which is very, very handy. So sometimes where the other books use select number of powders to pick from, what he has done is he's compiled all the different powder manufacturers' data and then has organized them so that they're in almost a spreadsheet format in order of velocity, so you can get the fastest velocities and then gradually work your way down if you want to develop loads that are a little bit lighter for a given purpose. But with all the different powders and burning rates out there, there's so much to pick from. And I think people get very much stuck in, they get stuck in the mud, frankly, about using individual powders. I've been at the, loading counter, getting some things from myself, and somebody has come up and they said, "Oh, don't you have any bullseye?" "No, sir. I got some green dot and I got some red dot." "No, I want bullseye." Well, if you only looked in a loading manual or referred to the powder sheet, the powder sheet that goes along with those powders, you'd find out that green dot and red dot surround the bullseye burning rate very, very closely, and virtually have the same usefulness. Never, ever, ever extrapolate that to mean that a powder's data can be swapped off with another powder's data. Each powder has its own particular loading data, and you can never just swap it off simply because they have the same burning rate. In other words, if you look in this particular book right here, you'll see that there is in Lee's book, you'll see that there's a burning rate chart. This was current when this book was published a few years ago. So there's a couple more that have been added to it, probably toward the slower burning rate, which has become more popular these days for high velocity small bore cartridges. But the different numbers that are associated with different powders, in other words, the different burning rates that are associated with different powders. Say, for instance, you might have a powder burning rate that's number 45. That might be the same powder burning rate as Reloader 15, and it may be the same burning rate as IMR 4320. I think they are. But that doesn't mean that you can change your powders just simply by converting them from one weight to another. You can't do that. Neither can you convert one volume to another. They don't work that way. They change characteristics when they're loaded into the case under actual firing conditions. And each powder has its own peculiarities, and each one has to be worked up individually. You cannot assume that two or three powders that all have, say, burning rate 41 can all be used with the same loading data. In all likelihood, you're going to have gross variations in the volume and in the actual charge weight. So it's not what it always appears. But that doesn't mean that there isn't great usefulness in knowing those numbers, because if you happen to need a powder which is, say, in burning rate 50, and the store that you're going to doesn't have burning rate 50, you can certainly pick any one of the powders. If you're armed with that knowledge, you can pick any one of the powders that are, somewhere around there between, say, 47 to 55, for instance, and you're going to find data in the loading book that will correspond to those various powders, and you can try other powders, and they're very, very useful. In any given loading, the manufacturers list only a small selection of the varied powders that are available for many different for the different cartridges. Let's, for instance, go to a popular cartridge right now, the 260 Remington, and with a 140 grain bullet. Now this is just Nosler's selection of powders. Now they've only listed just these powders right here, and let's see, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. They're only listed 9 powders. Well, I guarantee you that there are probably closer to 4 times that many powders that are actually available that could be used with that same bullet weight in that same cartridge. So don't get hung up on powders. Be open-minded and understand that they have many different cross purposes, and that there is each cartridge can burn a very, very wide range of burning rates with individual powders. So you could have a bullet weight that can handle extremely fast burning powders for 150 grain bullet, all the way up to the very slowest burning rates. And the changes in velocity are not as great as many people presume them to be. They're usually, from the fastest to the slowest burning, it's usually somewhere around 200 to 250 feet per second in velocity range. If you've seen what I have to say about this in other videos, you'll know that 100 feet per second translates to, with a pointed high velocity rifle bullet, 100 feet per second translates to around 20 to 21 or so yards of actual performance. 200 feet per second translates to about less than 45 yards of actual performance. It's not as great as many people perceive it to be. So it's always a good thing to be open-minded and to not just go to a book and pick out the fastest velocity, because sometimes, quite often, there are other powders that will operate at far more efficient, more accurate regions, and with less recoil, and be more economical, and every other thing for the simply difference of maybe 40 or 50 feet per second. And that 40 or 50 feet per second amounts to a coin toss. There's no difference in range, really. So I want to show you what some of these powders look like and explain how they're manufactured. Now here's a sample of powders that I have on hand for different purposes, for shotguns, pistols, and rifle loads. Now, powders have different conformation. There are generally flake powders, there are extruded powders, and there are ball, or also called spherical powders. Commonly speaking, most of your original powders were made for military uses. That's where you got the term IMR, improved military rifle powder. And they were also used for commercial purposes for commercial cartridge manufacturers. The various original powders were far fewer than what we have now, simply because the manufacturers maintained as small a stock as possible of powders in order to load the broadest range of cartridges. And that technique is also very well recommended for the average person. It's believe it or not, it's very easy for the average person to possess one powder for most of his shotgun and pistol uses, and one powder for his rifle uses. It's, if for the average person, if he had unique powder on hand, he'd be able to load for his shotgun or his handgun or light rifle loads. He'd be able to use 4895 or 4064 powder for virtually all of his rifle loads. But that doesn't have to close the book right there. There are so many more to choose from, which give the average shooter so many more options for velocity and accuracy, because certain loads, just for some reason or another, unknown to mankind, certain powders just seem to work better with certain loads, and other powders work better with other loads. And nobody really knows exactly why. We can generalize and say that a particular cartridge prefers a slower burning rate powder with a particular bullet size, but it may be one brand of powder over another that rifle prefers, even though it's the same burning rate. So let's go across the chart here. This is red dot powder. This is a flake powder, which has identifying flakes in it. So you can see with this red dot, it has the identifying flakes, and similarly there's blue dot and green dot, and those also have identifying flakes. Powders are not generally, you generally cannot identify powders by looking at them, and it's poor practice to do so. But red dot powder was the first powder I ever purchased for loading shotgun shells, and it's extremely useful in many different pistol loads, especially the 44 special and the 38 special, things like that. It's a wide range of usefulness, and you can see they are flattened flakes. These are flakes which are rather uniform. They're all uniform in size, and they're flat, and this is a very quick, fast burning powder. Unique is perhaps one of the most popular powders that was ever developed, and it's extremely popular in cartridges like the 45 auto, and it's got a very good usefulness also for light reduced lead bullet loads in rifle cartridges. As you can see, some of these powders have got a little hole in the middle, and that helps control the burning rate. There are different things that manufacturers do to control the burning rate of powders, and that's to apply various coatings, or the shape of the individual granule, the thickness, the diameter, and all these things help control the burning rate to a very, very finite degree. Let's move over to the next one. This is accurate number 2. Accurate number 2 has got extremely fine granules. It's a ball powder. This is similar in burning rate to very popular bullseye powder. It's a very, very economical powder for use in pistols, especially. It has a great range of usefulness for target loads in handguns. Accurate number 7, you can see, is a slightly larger granule. There's an accurate number 5 in between them, but accurate number 7 is very useful for higher power loads that fill the case a little bit more with higher intensity cartridges. A very, very popular powder for that use, and it's very, very these accurate powders, because of their shape and their particular the size, makes them very, very easy to measure through measures that are used on automated systems. I'll move along a little bit here now. This is Hodgdon HS6. This is also a popular powder for higher intensity pistol cartridges. Winchester 231 is a very, very popular pistol powder, which is one of the earlier ball powders. Winchester Olin was the company that developed ball powders for the military from surplus powders, and it's called a double-based powder. These powders these powders are very, very easy to meter, and there is I'll explain there's a difference in the way they are handled than extruded powders, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. IMR 4227 is an extremely popular powder among lead bullet shooters, especially with lower velocity rifle loads. This is a very, very short extruded powder made by the old DuPont company, IMR, which is now owned by Hodgdon. Oddly enough, it's rather weird that the company that developed its entire dynasty, which was DuPont, developed it on the manufacture of black powder down at the Brandywine River back centuries ago. But they became an anti-gun family toward the 70s and divested themselves of all holdings with gunpowder, which eventually now became owned by Hodgdon. Now here are some of the very popular rifle powders, starting with Hodgdon 4198, which was originally was a IMR 4198, extremely fast burning rifle powder, which is good in the 222 Remington, also a very popular powder for the 458 Winchester Magnum, because it's a fast burning rate, so therefore it responds best to cartridges that have low resistance. The next one, H322, it's a very similar burning rate to 4198 and was very popular with a lot of bench rest shooters, especially in the 222 Remington for years. It's a very, very easy powder to measure, to meter out, because it doesn't hang up in a powder measure. Benchmark is an extruded powder made by Hodgdon, which is similar in shape to many of the ball powders and has become very popular amongst accuracy-minded shooters because it combines the advantages of extruded powders that I'll speak of shortly with the advantages of ball powders. It's again one of the quicker burning powders that works in the same range of usefulness. Winchester 748 is a very, very popular powder, which is in a medium burning rate, very similar to Hodgdon's CFE 223, which is copper fouling eraser. That's what that stands for. It has a component, it has an additive that makes copper in the bore become brittle, and so the copper flakes off before it builds up. But these are similar in burning rate, similar in loading density, but they can't be interchanged. Never assume that they can be interchanged. Varget, very popular powder for accuracy shooters. It is a fairly bulky powder. In many cases, it tends to cause overfilling of many cases before maximum velocity is achieved. So in other words, a lot of cartridges, especially the 223, are operating at with compressed loads before they reach their full velocity potential. And for that reason, powders such as that are not that useful in automated progressive presses, because they simply cannot be trusted to properly compact during the loading operation. They require a loading tube sometimes if you're using compressed charges, and it's best to avoid compressed charges if at all possible. A compressed charge requires a device like this. This is a funnel with a long drop tube, and that drop tube will help stack the powder so that it basically aligns itself in the cartridge case uniformly and fills the case more evenly without having to compress the bullet down. But that's best to be avoided if you can. IMR 4064 powder is probably one of the most popular powders that was ever developed. It has been improved in recent years. It used to be, let's see if I can just slide this paper over here without causing a big upset. It was improved in recent years by making it a little bit shorter so that it's not as long and stringy as it used to be, and it goes through powder measures a lot more handily than it used to years ago. It's one of my more popular powders. It's a highly accurate powder in the 30-06 with 150 and 165 grain bullets. It's very, very accurate and efficient in the 22-250. A great usefulness in the 40-64. You know, it's one of those powders that together with 48-95 is perhaps, that covers probably the widest expanse of cartridges and bullet weights on the planet. It really is a highly useful powder, but again, it's not necessarily the most convenient powder. Now, accurate 40-64 has a different burning rate and has a different shape. It's not the same powder. Never assume that because they have the same numbers that they are the same powder. They're not different. Generally speaking, different manufacturers have their own burning rates, and they don't check with one another to correspond, and the numbers are of no significance whatsoever. There is a difference in the burning rate and the difference in the volume between those two. IMR 4320 is a very, very popular powder. It's probably not used and mentioned as often as it ought to be. That is very, very similar in performance to Reloader number 15. Reloader 15 and IMR 4320 have got very similar burning characteristics, and I found both of them to be absolutely superb in the 257 Roberts and the 22-250. H380 was a powder which Bruce Hodgson named because he found that 38 grains of powder in his 22-250 with a 55 grain bullet gave him superb accuracy. Well, that doesn't always work out that way for everybody, but that's how that got its name. H414 powder is a fairly slow, it's one of the slower burning ball powders, and H414 powder is very easy to meter. It is popular in the 22-250. It's popular for high performance loads in the 30-06. It's very, very easy to meter, and it's an extremely great powder for many purposes. Hybrid 100. This is a powder which combines some of the advantages of both single base and double base powders. I've tried it in just one cartridge in my 257 Roberts. I found it to be for whatever reason it seemed to have a very high felt recoil. So I haven't tried it in too many different loads. IMR 4350 powder is a moderately slow burning powder. Years ago this was the slowest burning powder for many years until 4831 came out. This is the powder that made the 270 and the 30-06 high-performance cartridges that gave them the velocities that they're known for today. And accurate 4350, again, it's a similar name, but it has a slightly different burning rate, and it has a different granular shape and size, and so therefore the volumes are not the same for given charge weights, and that's always important to understand. 4831, Hodgson claims that perhaps 4831 outsells all the other powders when it comes to high-performance Magnum cartridges, and this is the powder that really makes the 270 Winchester king of the hill. This powder here really is a super performer. It had the slight disadvantage of over-compacting and being a compressed charge in many different cases. So Hodgson developed a number of years ago, they developed H4831 SC, which stands for shortcut. And that particular powder has exactly the same, they tell you to use exactly the same loading data for weight-wise, not volume, but weight-wise, between the two. And this powder will allow you to put more powder in a case more easily without compressing it. This is a fantastic powder I found in the 300 Winchester Magnum. Very, very high velocity, easy to measure through a powder measure. It stacks easily in the case without compressing, and so you can. It's fantastic when you're using 200 and 220 grain bullets in 300 Winchester Magnum. Reload of 10 is a good powder, which is in the same burning rate, generally speaking, as Winchester 748 and Benchmark and CFE 223. It's in that same general burning rate. It's pretty useful. That's a good powder for the 6.8 Remington. And by the way, the 6.8 Remington, 6.8 happens to be 270. That's the actual 277 is the actual bullet diameter. The 6.8 might have actually gotten someplace if they had named it for what the bullet size it really is. Reload of 15. I think I mentioned this is extremely beautiful powder for many different loads. I'm finding this to be one of my more favorite powders of all, because it's very, very easy to meter, even though it's an extruded single base powder, and it meters very nicely. It's extremely accurate. I get my most accurate loads with my 257 Roberts and with my 22-250 with reload of 15. So that's just a small sample of the many different powders that are available out there, and there are many, many more. So don't feel as if I'm giving recommendations to any one at all. Now, if you happen to notice that if you think that you saw little holes in some of these powders, you did. I don't know how they do it, and I'd like to see the technology that arrives at that, but your extruded powders are made like macaroni. There's actually a little hole down the middle of many of them. Okay, we've taken a look at all the different powders that I have here on display, and gave you a brief glimpse at what they do and what they look like. Now, many people immediately will say, well, I prefer ball powders because they measure more consistently, more accurately. And other powder fans will proclaim that they use extruded powders because they're more consistent and have less variation in extremes of temperature. And both are correct. And both are wrong by assuming that that's the end of the story. Myself, I take a very pragmatic look at all aspects of loading. Extruded powders are, by their nature, because of the shape of them, they're shaped like little logs, varying lengths, and some of them are rather heavy granules. They can be rather stiff to put through a powder measure, because this drum is actually cutting maybe a few of those granules as it's measuring the powder column. That being said, extruded powders don't have any degree of fussiness that is often found with ball powders, and this has been my personal experience, and this is verified at most bench rest loading circuits. Most bench rest shooters that you find, they really favor a lot of the extruded powders, such as Varget, and there's some newer ones on the scene now, bench rest powders, that they're not necessarily the easiest powders to measure. And I'll say this to them too, that it's not necessary to go out and get a $400 trickling device to precisely measure out all your different powder. Accuracy buffs many years ago, back if you can find an old copy of Warren Page's book, The Accurate Rifle, they discovered a long time ago that the practice of weighing individual charges with extruded powders doesn't arrive at any accuracy improvement whatsoever. That the variations, the very slight variations that are found in a powder measure, a typical powder measure, is well within the accuracy parameters of any given powder. Sometimes I think the industry likes to, they create a lot of fussiness by suggestion. In other words, by having trickling devices, it suggests that there is a need for trickling devices. I have a trickler. I've had a trickler for many years, and it's this device right here. It's a manual trickler, and you'll say, well, that's not really up to speed, because nowadays you can get motorized ones that are computerized and all that. And, well, the only reason I use it is I use it to establish my loads when I'm working up my progressive loads, my incremental loads, working them up from top to bottom, or bottom to top, I should say. And it's a one-time thing only. So in other words, I'll load a group of maybe 5 or 6 different charges in a given caliber with a given bullet weight, and I'll place them into a loading tray, loading block, and I'll develop 4 loads. And I've mentioned this in another video, and I'll go back over it again today. But each of those charges is worked up, and I use a trickler for that purpose to bring up the scale to a very perfect dead center line on my balance beam, or you can use it on a digital scale. It makes no difference whatsoever. They're just as accurate. And after I have gone to the range and weeded out the most accurate load from those different charge weights based on the increments that are suitable for that particular cartridge capacity, then I nail it there. I figure out what the volume is going to be, and from that point on, I simply load directly from my right from my measure. And the only reason why I trickle them up to begin with is because I want to be absolutely sure that when I'm assigning my different incremental loads, that I'm actually using those increments, that I'm not working off of something else. So it's very easy for me to just twirl that and to place 3 or 4 more grains in the pan and bring it up to measure. But I also do that in conjunction with the measure. In other words, I set the measure so that it brings the charge within 2 or 3/10 of a grain, and then I finish it up with the trickler. Now that might sound laborious, and you can say, well, I can get an automated trickler to do that. Well, you can if you got that kind of money and you really value such details as that, but they won't get you anywhere. This system here, at far less expense, will do exactly the same thing, because once I've established my load, I just simply go down and I charge every single case like that. Okay. Ball powders are extremely useful in automated systems. For instance, my Loadmaster, when I'm loading 223 cases or 9mm or 45s or 44 Magnums or whatever, I will use a powder which dispenses very, very uniformly and very compactly from the loading disc or whatever happens to be the measure that's sitting on top of that day. And those powders, the certain requirements for those powders, I'm more interested in volume shooting. I'm not really interested. My Mini 14 is a 2.5 MOA gun at best, that's military grade accuracy. Whatever degree of uniformity is possible for the 223 is certainly achievable from the powders that are dispensed in that system. So I'll typically use a powder like CFE 223 or something like that gives me uniform drops, and you don't want a powder that overfills the case, because as that carousel goes around with the vibrations, you don't want to have powders that are bouncing out. So you want to have powders that drop in and fill the case without being up into the neck of the case and creating that potential for a mess. And that mess can get to be a hazard, and it can clog up your machine. With regard to ball powders for other cartridges, I have them. One of my most accurate loads for the 22-250 can be H414 powder, but it can also be the most inaccurate on any given day. It's an extremely fussy powder, as with many ball powders. It can be erratic. But if I happen to go out on a day where it's 85 degrees in the summer, and once I get that chamber a little bit warm, those cartridges are not the same as they were when I loaded them in the house. And any experienced shooter will tell you that that particular ball powder can start to get a little bit erratic on a hot day, or even just because of a warm chamber. So it can be the very best of powders, and it can be the very worst of powders. And when it tends to become inaccurate, it does it very, very well. It goes from being minute groups to being big groups. So, but that won't happen with powders that tend to be a little bit more uniform. For instance, Reloader 15, I'll find, or IMR 4064, 4895. Many of the extruded powders, they may not have that pinhole accuracy on a given day, but they will have better overall accuracy that I can count on from day to day. And those would be the powders that I would pick if I were, competing in a match where I had to rely on knowing where those bullets were going to go every different time I pull the trigger. So understand that they all have usefulness. I will always take a ball powder where it's important to have speed of measurement. In other words, this is where Olin really came into the game during World War II, where they developed ball powders that could be rapidly loaded in cases at fast production speeds without having to worry about variations. That was a great way to go, and they still have the same usefulness today. I don't recommend ball powders when you're working at top velocity levels within a particular load that are going to be used on in hot days, because it's a powder that can go through the roof. But extruded powders, I think, are very friendly. They clunk and they clack when you go through a measure. You'll feel certain powders, you feel as if you're grinding coffee. And again, don't worry about that, because the variations that you'll find actually on paper don't amount to anything. I just recently did a test where I was testing various loads with Reloader 15, and I went through 5 increments at 0.4 of a grain all the way up, and the impact zone on the target didn't change. In fact, I'll show you that target. Okay. On this particular day, a couple of weeks ago, actually it was only a few days ago, I fired a test involving Reloader powder with Reloader 15 powder with 53 grain Match King Sierra bullets, and I was also checking not only load increments working up the line, but I was also checking to see if there was a difference between standard primers and Magnum primers in that particular cartridge, because sometimes Magnum primers will just work out better for particular cartridges for whatever reason. And we'll talk about primers on another video. But as you can see right here, both of these primers worked out very well with different charge weights. You can see right here, this is the standard load, nice group size with 3 shots, and this one here measured even a little nicer. Those were the two top loads, the 2 best loads, and this is what the standard primer composite. I saved 1 round from each of the increments, and I fired a composite group at the end. And this is an extruded powder. This is a range of powder weights now from, let me just make sure I have this right, ranging from 34.9 grains up to 36.5. That's a pretty broad spread. And this is what that composite shot to. So this is a composite that ranges from a very, very broad range of powder weights, and yet they all printed within 0.915. That's sub-MOA with that huge degree of variation. So that shows you, and here I have the other composite. Let me see if I can find that one. Here's the Magnum rifle. The Magnum primer composite. The Magnum primer composite measured 1.8. However, if you take a look, there was only one flyer that really put it out of the group. The rest of them were even much closer than that. So, and if you notice another thing, even between targets, I didn't change scope settings. Even between targets, the placement of the holes on the paper is in virtually the same place. So that shows you why you can't, you really, there's no justification for being overly fussy and trickling loads. If I'm getting sub-MOA with a range of charges that goes from 34.9 up to 36.5 grains in a case capacity of a 22-250, you can see where it's of no value whatsoever to fuss about a couple of tenths of a grain that might possibly vary from this. That 2/10 of a grain doesn't mean a thing. If you're charging with ball powders, you don't have to worry about it anyway because they're going to charge within a tenth of a grain or less. So that's the real story when it comes to those different powders. Okay, so let's show you how this whole process comes together. I picked out my bullets. I've got some, this is an old box of bullets right here. This is 60 grain Hornady 224 diameter bullets, hollow points, beautiful bullet that I've had for a great number of years. I've got some pre-primed and prepared Lapua cases with some Winchester Standard large rifle primers. I've got some accurate 4064 extruded powder that should work really nicely in this cartridge, and loading block, powder funnel, scale of your choice. You can have either a digital scale or a balanced beam scale, a trickler, and a calculator. So join us in the next video and we'll put all this together and show you how it goes. God bless.